Pursuant to the House Resolution 315 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2218. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House of the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2218, which the Clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act to encourage recovery and beneficial use of coal combustion residuals and establish requirements for the proper management and disposal of coal combustion residuals that are protective of human health and the environment.
Pursuant to the rule, this bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. SHIMKUS, and the gentleman from California, Mr. WAXMAN, each will control 30 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 2218.
Thank you. The request needs to be made in the full House, not in the Committee of the Whole.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time that I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have spent much time talking about the need for Congress to consider jobs legislation. This is a piece of pro-job legislation. This bill is unique because it also is a pro-states' rights legislation and pro-environmental legislation. But focusing on jobs for a minute, let me explain why a no vote is an anti-jobs, placing anywhere from 39,000 to 316,000 jobs at risk at a time when we can least afford it. We are here because for over 3 years ago, the EPA put out 3 proposals on coal ash, including regulating coal ash as a hazardous waste. This caused massive uncertainty in the marketplace and created an unnecessary stigma on a legitimate recycling of this product. And I have a piece of shingle that's made and produced by coal ash. As the states agree, as highlighted in a letter from the state of Michigan in support of H.R. 2218, enactment would end the regulatory uncertainty that has hindered our efforts to promote the beneficial use of coal and combustion residuals. EPA announced in litigation proceedings recently that it will not have a final coal ash rule before 2014. The fact that EPA continues to leave a hazardous waste designation on the table, even though 3 decades of science and fact and point the other way that coal ash is not hazardous, it directly is contributing to the loss of current and future recycling. Coal ash is not an abstract substance. It is used in important infrastructure in this country. The American Coal Ash Association informed us that uncertainty in the marketplace caused by EPA's proposal to regulate coal ash as hazardous waste is diminishing their economic prospects down to just 40% of eligible coal waste, and they support this bill. This bill establishes a solid framework for regulation of coal combustion residuals in a manner that is protective of human health and the environment, or the state environmental regulators, including the Environmental Council of the States, ECOS, and the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, would not be endorsing this bill. Coal ash makes concrete stronger, more durable, and cheaper. A no vote against this bill means that you support less durable, more expensive highway, schools, and green buildings. Don't take my word for it. The American Road and Transportation Builders Association and many other road and bridge builders, and also the Building and Construction Trades Union, wants this bill because they want high-quality construction material for buildings, roads, and bridges. For members concerned about wallboard from China, coal ash is stable, domestic source for wallboard and will control costs. Don't take my word for it. The American Forest and Paper Association supports this bill. Mine workers across this country need a stable way of having America's energy future secured. This bill accomplishes that. Don't take my word for it. Ask the United Mine Workers who support this bill. Coal ash is recycled and used as a raw material in making cement. Voting no means you choose to put coal ash in landfills rather than putting it back into roads and building projects. Don't take my word for it. Organizations like Portland Cement Association, the Phoenix Cement Company, and the Wisconsin Ready Mix Concrete Association and the Washington Aggregates and Concrete Association, they all support this bill. A vote against this bill is a vote for prolonged regulatory uncertainty. A vote against this bill is a vote to increase costs on the federal, state, and local governments and infrastructures. A vote against this bill is a vote to increase costs on all Americans and to dare unemployment to go even higher. A vote against this bill is a direct message to career state employees in states across this country that you do not trust them to do the right thing regarding regulation of coal ash. This bill is a pro-jobs, pro-environment, anti-bureaucracy bill. If you want progress instead of process, protection instead of politics, and jobs instead of a continued uncertainty, vote for this bill. We find ourselves in this morass of regulatory uncertainty because the existing approach to environmental regulation. This bill presents a new approach that will reduce the inefficiencies of our federal rulemaking process by setting a national standard in the statute and charging the states with implementation. If you support protecting jobs and preserving state rights, and if you trust your state environmental regulators to protect your communities, you need to support this bill and vote yes on final passage. And with this, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Today, the House is considering legislation to block EPA from acting to ensure that toxic coal ash is safely disposed of. The coal ash is the result of the coal that has been burned, and this coal ash needs to be disposed of. Now, what the Republicans who are suggesting this bill be adopted are suggesting is that we remove public health protections in order to allow polluting disposal sites to continue with business as usual. And that's a little tough to justify. As we led up to today's debate, we've heard some outlandish justifications, and I just want to set the record straight. First of all, we've been told this is a states' rights bill because we need this legislation in order for the states to impose adequate regulation on dangerous coal ash disposal sites. Well, that's not true. The states can regulate coal ash disposal today, and in fact, many do. The problem is that many states are not doing a good job. For example, in Ohio, the coal ash disposal sites have serious groundwater contamination problems. The coal ash at these sites have contaminated groundwater with arsenic, mercury, and radioactive levels of materials higher than allowed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Well, in total, EPA has identified 133 cases of groundwater and surface water contamination at coal ash disposal sites. All of this has occurred under existing law where state laws can be effective and states can act. The problem is they're not all acting. Secondly, the proponents of this bill have argued we have to pass this legislation to allow coal ash to be recycled. Well, they argue EPA wants to designate coal ash as, quote, hazardous, end quote. Well, that isn't what EPA proposed at all. They say that this designation would be a stigma on coal ash and it would ensure there would be no longer any market for recycled coal ash, but that argument is just plain wrong. Hazardous labeling and restrictions on beneficial reuse are simply not at issue. When EPA issued its proposed coal ash rule, the agency offered a couple of alternatives. Neither of these proposals would involve labeling coal ash as hazardous. And quite frankly, even if it were designated hazardous, that doesn't mean it can't be reused. It can be reused. Third, we've been told that we must pass this legislation because it's a careful compromise from the version of the last Congress. Well, I'm not sure who was in that compromise, because the bill is even worse than the bill from the last Congress. The Republicans have refused to work with the Democrats on the committee. There's no bipartisan coal ash bill in the Senate. The administration has identified 5 problems with the bill that cause it to fall short of protecting human health and the environment. Let's focus on the reality. This debate is not about a war on coal or putting a stigma on coal ash. It's not about whether state governments are inherently better than the federal government. It's not about job-killing regulations. This debate is about whether or not we're going to allow coal ash disposal sites to contaminate our water supplies and threaten human health. If this bill is enacted, coal ash disposal sites will continue to pollute our groundwater. And once contamination is confirmed, well, this bill would allow it to continue for another 10 years and do nothing. And then after that, they might even continue it for another indefinite period of time. So it will continue to pollute groundwater, the water we drink, and our water supplies and our water sources. This bill says that a dump site that is contaminating groundwater today can pollute for 10 years. More arsenic, more mercury, more lead. Is that what members of the House want to vote for? If the owners of the polluting structure can't control their contamination within 10 years, this bill says states can give them even more time to keep polluting. New information released yesterday reveals that 3/4 of existing unlined coal ash impoundments do not have the space at their existing locations to construct an additional disposal facility. Those facts practically guarantee that if this legislation were to be enacted, communities across the country, many of them poor and minority, will simply have to endure contaminated water, polluted air, and the risk of catastrophic dam failure. And why? For states' rights, where the states already have the rights? It's really for polluter rights. And polluters do not have and should not have a right to pollute our water supplies. This can be handled effectively through a serious piece of legislation that will make clear that public health protection must be enforced. I urge my colleagues to tune out the special interest misinformation that seeks to weaken our laws, prolong pollution, and oppose this legislation. No matter how you voted in the last Congress, this bill is worse, and I urge members to vote against it today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask my colleague to look at the 11 additional changes that have been made in this bill versus the last bill and realize how much we have moved in the direction that he speaks of. I now recognize the author of the legislation, Mr. McKinley, for 7 minutes.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 2218. For 33 years, Congress has wrestled unproductively with how to deal with coal ash, an unavoidable byproduct of burning coal. After countless hearings, meetings, and amendments, we come here today with a solution. Over the past 2.5 years, we've listened to environmental organizations, industry, senators, the states, the EPA. Now the bill has strong bipartisan support with Democrat co-sponsors and a broad coalition of over 300 organizations and businesses, including state environmental officials, governors, recyclers, manufacturers, coal miners, coal operators, and labor unions, just to name a few. If we don't act decisively, Congress will once again kick the can down the road. That would mean the status quo continues. At the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearing on the draft legislation earlier this year, EPA Assistant Administrator Matthew Stanislaus testified that states have the ability to ensure proper management and disposal of coal ash under this legislation. At that hearing, my good friend from Illinois, Mr. SHIMKUS, asked Mr. Stanislaus if the EPA was not opposed to this language of the bill. Stanislaus' response was, "That is correct." Even the President has become engaged in this debate. The statement from the administration this past week noted they appreciate the efforts of the House and issued no veto threat. No opposition was expressed. That ought to tell you something. The opponents of this legislation should read the last sentence of the administration's statement. The administration would like to work with Congress to allow for the development, implementation, and enforcement of appropriate standards for managing coal combustion residuals while encouraging the beneficial use of this economically important material. Let me show you what we're talking about here. This is This is a jar of fly ash. Every day, coal ash is produced in 48 of our 50 states across America. This is a national issue, not just one for coal states. Over 140 million tons of coal ash are produced annually. Approximately 40% of the material is recycled into everyday products used in households and the construction industry. The remaining 60% is disposed of in landfills. Now, 2218 deals separately with both of these issues. The first part deals with recycling. Early in the Obama administration, the EPA proposed a rule to declare coal ash as a hazardous material, despite the fact that under the Bill Clinton administration, the EPA had already determined in 1993 and 2000 the coal ash was not hazardous. Let me repeat that. They've already said it's not hazardous. No industrialized nation in the world classifies fly ash as a hazardous material. Deeming it such would essentially destroy the ability to recycle coal ash, dramatically increase the cost of electricity, and crush hundreds of thousands of jobs across America. The United States already has a much lower rate of recycling than other countries. Europe recycles over 90% of the fly ash, China over 65%, and Japan 95% of their coal ash is recycled. We should be encouraging recycling, not standing in the way. The second part of the bill deals with processes for disposing of coal ash that is not recycled. The section has been significantly strengthened and provides for all new and existing landfills to be state-run using the federal law known as RCRA, which incorporates federal standards and requirements for protecting, quote, human health and the environment. RCRA's primary goal are to, quote, protect human health and the environment, to reduce the amount of waste generated, and to ensure that wastes are managed in an environmentally sound manner. Consequently, under this bill, disposal requirements will require composite liners, air quality and dust controls, groundwater protection standards, emergency action plans, corrective actions for deficiencies, inspections of structural stability. Let's make it clear. If a landfill ever becomes deficient, it must be fixed. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's just that simple. For example, under the corrective action under Section 4011, subsection C2B, and an owner or an operator of a deficient facility is not relieved of their obligation to develop alternative disposal capabilities, regardless of whether they have the space site available. For anyone to argue otherwise, perhaps they haven't read the bill. For the first time, there will be a uniform national stand for disposal. Or Congress can do nothing. It can, just like it has been for the last 33 years. But I don't think we should continue with the status quo. Working in this bipartisan fashion, we've made progress. After 30 years of debate, it's time for action. Our constituents deserve protection for their health and environment. This legislation makes it possible. We often hear Congress isn't voting on a jobs bill. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, there's not a clear jobs bill that we're going to deal with in this Congress, protecting 316,000 jobs across America and preventing utility bills to increase. We must protect these jobs. I encourage all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this pro-health, pro-environment, and pro-jobs legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, the administration and I would like to work out a bill with the Republicans. But this bill has two problems. After all is said and done, there is no requirement that they protect public health and the environment. There's all sorts of language to say we want them to, but if states don't do that, there's a second problem is there's no enforcement. There's nothing to make them do it. Now, if you have no real clear standard to protect public health and no enforcement to make sure public health is being protected, that's a bill that's asking for continuation of pollution of our groundwater supplies. We can work together and get a bill But this administration has said it does not adequately protect public health and the environment. It doesn't address the real problems. Even some of the changes that they have made this bill worse. It's a bill that we should reject and then go back to the negotiating table. Mr. Chairman, at this point I wish to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Energy, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
From Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, here we go again. With the Republicans spewing their shamelessly empty rhetoric concerning jobs. Jobs for the American people might be on their minds. Jobs for the American people might be in their mouths, but jobs for the American people are not in their hearts. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are arguing that we need to weaken our environmental laws to create jobs. That's incredibly short-sighted. Do we really want to say to the American people that they must suffer contaminated groundwater, drink dirty water? Is that what we're saying? A study from Tufts University shows just the opposite. It's not a fight between jobs and clean environment, clean water, clean drinking water. The Tufts study says that we can create tens of thousands of new jobs by requiring safe disposal of coal ash. Ensuring that coal ash disposal sites protect human health and the environment will take work, will create jobs. It will take construction workers, equipment operators, and engineers to do this work. And let me add that this is not just makeshift work. These jobs will provide tremendous benefits to the communities in which they take place. But these jobs won't happen if we pass this atrocious bill. This bill simply preserves the status quo and keep Americans out of work. Mr. Chairman, when it comes to protecting the public health and ensuring that all Americans have unhindered access to clean air, land, and water, I am very, very sensitive to the issue of ensuring that there are, at the very least, minimum state or federal standards, and that the U.S. EPA has the full authority to enforce those standards. Mr. Chairman, due to a case in my district of Crestwood, Illinois, where contaminated drinking water was piped into the homes of my constituents for over 20 years, between 1986 and 2007. And the state of Illinois refused to intervene. I cannot support legislation that bars the U.S. EPA from enforcing state or federal standards, as this atrocious, shameful bill does. Mr. Chairman, states' rights might mean states' inaction, as in the case of Crestwood, Illinois, where it was only the determined, courageous act of a citizen by the name of Tricia Krause, who had the courage to alert the media to this shameful act being committed by elected officials, those responsible for taking care of the public health and ensuring that the environment was safe, and the water that in the morning, in the evening, during the day that they drank was safe. These officials, these local officials had that responsibility, and they turned their back on the people of the village of Crestwood. And not only did they turn their back, not only did they
Chairman is
turn their
recognized
back,
for one additional minute.
not only did they turn their back, but the Illinois EPA, the state EPA, refused to even investigate this matter. I had to get the U.S. Justice Department and the U.S. EPA to end this atrocity. If this bill is ever enacted, it will bar the federal government, at the very least, from serving as the last backstop for the American people against polluters who will seek to skirt the law without regard to the families and communities that they serve. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the people who are members of this Congress, who have a heart and a mind to not only put the American people back to work, but also to protect the environment.
Time has expired.
This effort and vote no on this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
And my colleagues that the administration has not issued a veto threat on this bill, and I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from West Virginia for his outstanding work on this legislation, and also to Mr. SHIMKUS, who is the chairman of the subcommittee, for his leadership on the issue. And I do rise today in support of the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act of 2013. I'm an original co-sponsor on that legislation. Now, I think it comes as no surprise to anybody that this administration has declared their war on coal. You can listen to the comments that are coming out of the president and his advisors there at the White House. They've done everything in their power to shut down coal plants and to put American coal miners on the unemployment line. The EPA has targeted everything from existing coal-fired plants to new plants, coal mining operations, and has been looking at labeling coal ash as a hazardous waste since 2010. Now, unbeknownst to so many individuals and so many of my constituents is the fact that the same coal ash that has been used safely to make, and get this, bricks, cement, asphalt, plastics, and is used as a filler in wood products is all of a sudden a hazardous waste. I would like the administration to explain to me if coal ash was a hazardous waste when they used TARP funding for shovel-ready projects to repair roads with asphalt containing, guess what? Coal ash. Was coal ash a hazardous waste last winter when it was used in snow and ice control products to keep roads and pedestrians in Chicago safe? Or was coal ash a hazardous waste when it was used to build the EPA's new headquarters? While I am sure most of my constituents would like to label the EPA's headquarters a Superfund site, I would say let's support this bill, and I can yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from
Chairman,
California.
if coal ash is reused, it is not a hazardous waste. If it is stored and leaks into our groundwater or our drinking water, it can be very hazardous. The problem with the Republican bill is it doesn't clearly state that public health must be protected, and when they state it, there's no clear enforcement. EPA can't be sure that the job is being done, and even citizens cannot file lawsuits to require it to be done. This is a special interest bill that does not serve the interests of the American people. And I'd like to now yield to the gentleman who is the ranking member of one of our energy subcommittees, gentleman from New York. 5 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman from California, and I thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, the House will consider a bill that provides the states with what they already have, the authority to regulate the disposal of coal ash. H.R. 2218 also virtually eliminates any regulatory role for the Environmental Protection Agency. Although the bill's title suggests that it is about the beneficial reuse of coal combustion residuals, it has little, if anything, to do with promoting that worthy goal. No one has disputed that it is preferable to reduce the amount of coal ash that ends up in disposal facilities. It saves money and lengthens the productive life of that disposal facility. And it means that a waste product is put to productive use in cement, in wallboard, and in other products. All of those things happen now, and they will happen whether this bill passes or not. Actually, if the bill encouraged stronger standards for disposal, it would likely spur increased recycling. Another opportunity squandered, in my opinion. So, if it is not about recycling, what is this bill about? It is about maintaining the status quo. The bill virtually ensures that deficient facilities will indeed remain deficient. And what does that mean? It means that communities and states with weak programs and lax enforcement remain at risk. This bill does not set credible standards to ensure that public health and the environment are protected. Communities whose groundwater sources are known today to be contaminated by toxins leaching from unlined disposal ponds will have to wait at least 10 years before a state would have to act. And even then, there are provisions for granting additional time for an operator to upgrade or repair a leaking facility. We know from recent experience that some of these facilities are structurally unsound. A breach in the dam in Kingston, Tennessee in 2008, in eastern Wisconsin in 2011, and in Martins Creek, Pennsylvania in 2005 all sent coal ash spilling out into waterways and onto the land. H.R. 2188 is not going to help us avoid adding accidents to this list. Very similar bills to this one passed the House several times in the last Congress. They failed to become law, and H.R. 2188, in my opinion, is going to follow that same path. Communities living in the shadow of these facilities deserve to be protected. There is no reason to allow deficient facilities to pollute our water and our air and jeopardize the health of people and communities across this great nation. We can do better. We should do better. My colleagues and I will offer several amendments this morning that, if adopted, would improve this bill. A better legislative effort could resolve the uncertainty surrounding this issue, and more importantly, ensure that our citizens' health and safety are protected. We cannot afford more Kingstons. We do not have to. Without improvements, this legislation will proceed no further in the legislative process. Without improvements, it should not proceed any further. I oppose H.R. 2218 in its present form, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman goes back. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me remind my colleagues some of the special interests. The United Mine Workers, Building and Construction Trades, and the Transportation Workers of America. I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2218, the Coal Residual Reuse and Management Act, an important and bipartisan jobs bill. Today's vote is the culmination of over a 2-year pursuit of a thoughtful, sensible, transparent solution to a serious regulatory challenge. And while the coal ash bill has continued to improve since we first debated and passed the legislation back in 2011, we've stayed true to our original principles. First, the bill sets out strict standards for coal ash management, but leaves the permitting program to the states. This approach is important because it ensures consistent environmental protection, but gives the day-to-day implementation to the states, who have the combination of expertise and dedication to get the job done right for their state. Second, it takes EPA's 3-year proposal to regulate coal ash as hazardous waste off the table. When EPA first published this proposal, they knew that if it overreached, the EPA would face a very tough dilemma. They wanted a permit program for coal ash, but in fact the Solid Waste Disposal Act did not give EPA the authority over coal ash unless it was labeled hazardous. This legislation offers a solution. The administration has stopped asking for the hazardous designation, and good thing, beginning this year, EPA stopped seeking that the agency, instead of the states, do the permitting. The administration has come a long way, and we certainly commend them for that. But meanwhile, we've been listening to and working with the EPA. And on April 11th of this year, EPA testified before our committee by moving past the notion that EPA should write regulations for each state, the administration finally acknowledged that the states are in the best position to implement coal ash permit programs. After our hearing, we had additional meetings with the EPA to discuss the bill, and we ultimately made changes. Can I have 30 additional seconds?
3 additional seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
And we ultimately made changes that the EPA recommended, including adding tough deadlines for state action. This is how the legislative process is supposed to work. The bill reflects crucial input over the last 2 years from House and Senate Republicans, Democrats, and the administration. The time has come to put our pencils down and enact this law so that we can close the regulatory gap. States, utilities, and hundreds of thousands of workers in the recycling industry have been waiting in limbo for a resolution. This bill meets those needs. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time is left on each side?
Gentleman from California has 13 minutes left. The gentleman from Illinois has 15 and a half minutes left.
We'll continue to reserve our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized. Gentleman from California reserved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes from a member who is very helpful in this legislation, Mr. LATTA from Ohio.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thank the chairman for yielding. I rise today, Mr. Chairman, in support of the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act, designating coal ash as a hazardous waste, which the EPA proposed in June 2010 would not only raise energy prices for families and businesses, but also destroy a large coal ash recycling industry and all the jobs that come with it. H.R. 2218 will protect these jobs by setting minimum standards for the states will be charged with implementing and by providing regulatory certainty that has ceased to exist within the coal ash industry since 2009. If this legislation is not signed into law, the EPA will overturn 30 years of precedent and designate coal ash a hazardous waste despite findings that the Department of Energy, the Federal Highway Administration, state regulatory authorities, and the EPA itself that the toxicity levels in coal ash are well below the criteria that requires a hazardous waste designation. In fact, in the EPA's May 2000 regulatory determination, EPA concluded that coal ash does not warrant regulation as a hazardous waste and that doing so would be environmentally counterproductive. It is estimated that meeting the regulatory disposal requirements under the EPA's proposal would cost between $250 and $450 per ton, as opposed to about $100 per ton under the current system. In 2008, 136 million tons of coal ash was generated. That means that passing this bill could put an additional $20 to $47 million burden on the electricity generators that use coal. Energy costs aside, about 45% of coal ash generated is recycled, being used as an additive in cement, concrete, wallboard, roofing materials, road-based fill materials, and snow and ice control. Designating coal ash as a hazardous waste could halt these beneficial uses, which the EPA estimates will lead to $16.7 million in increased costs per year. It will provide certainty in the coal ash industry and strikes the appropriate balance of strong environmental protection without all the economic consequences of a hazardous waste designation. I urge support of the legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to a very distinguished member of our committee, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank our ranking member for allowing me time. I rise to express strong support for H.R. 2218, the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act. Last Congress, this chamber twice passed legislation on a bipartisan basis that was weaker than the bill before us today. Last Congress, the effort resulted in legislation to create a state-run waste disposal program with minimum federal requirements while assuring that coal ash can continue to be reused and recycled in everyday products. The legislation before the House today continues that model, but with even greater environmental protections, including accelerated requirements for groundwater monitoring, fixed deadlines for when problems at compound may be cured, and a periodic inspections for the structural integrity of impoundments. Currently, there's a patchwork of state programs to regulate the disposal of coal combustible waste with no federal oversight. H.R. 2218 would be the first time to establish comprehensive minimum federal standards for coal ash management and disposal and give the EPA the authority to enforce the compliance if a state does not establish a coal residuals permit program or if a state's program does not conform with federal requirements. This legislation would assure that coal ash can be continued to be used beneficially, which puts billions of dollars in our economy annually and protects tens of thousands of jobs in the beneficial reuse industry. Encouraging beneficial reuse of coal ash ensures less of it ends up in landfills, which is good for the environment and good for our economy. I know some members are concerned about the legislation, but we've worked diligently with the majority and stakeholders to make improvements in the bill. The assertions by some of my colleagues that the legislation does not do nothing to protect the environment are making the perfect the enemy of the good. Part of the legislating is moving the ball forward, and we cannot continue to work on legislation. It simply will die in the Senate. This bill is a reasonable compromise and a win-win for the American people that will help protect the environment and create jobs, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back.
Before I yield back my time, I want to point out to my colleagues, this bill will not make it into law. The Senate will not accept it. The President will not support it in its present form because it doesn't protect public health. Coal ash contains arsenic, barium, cadmium, lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, and other toxic materials. It's a threat not when the coal ash is used for other purposes, but when it's in a disposal site and leaks into our drinking water. And that's what this issue is all about. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves or yields back? You reserve?
A reserve, yes.
All right. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Texas who's helped us move the bill even in a direction. I'll remind my colleagues that the President has not issued a veto signal on this piece of legislation. I would then like to yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to express my support for the Coal Residual Reuse and Management Act. I want to thank Mr. McKinley and his staff for their hard work on this very important issue. This common sense legislation will empower states to safely regulate coal combustion products by fixed standards without overwhelming state budgets or customers' wallets. The recycling and reuse of coal combustion products has great economic and environmental benefits, creating jobs, reducing emissions, extending the life and durability of the nation's roads and bridges, and reducing deposits in landfills and surface impoundments. This legislation will provide the certainty states, utilities, and businesses depend on, all while giving the EPA the authority to protect the public should a state fail to enforce these strong standards. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize Mr. Bouchon from Indiana, a neighbor across from my congressional district, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this legislation. Every single coal mine in the state of Indiana is in my congressional district. Coal not only provides thousands of jobs for Hoosiers, but provides over 90% of our state's energy. Coal is a vital part of Indiana's economy, helping to keep energy prices low and supporting a robust manufacturing sector. I disagree with the EPA's position that coal ash should be treated as a hazardous material. Coal ash has been described as used in all kinds of other materials like concrete and has been proven safe when used correctly and when stored correctly. In fact, the EPA's own studies, as also has been mentioned in 1993 and 2000, have stated that coal ash is not a hazardous material. This legislation allows states to establish their own regulations for managing coal ash as long as it meets minimum federal standards. Coal is necessary for an all-of-the-above energy plan and is vital to our nation's energy production needs that sustains good-paying jobs. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
I inquire, Mr. Chairman, of the chairman of the subcommittee how many speakers he has on his side.
Yeah, if the gentleman will yield, we have, of course, a lot of support on this side for this piece of legislation and a lot of people who still want to talk.
Then we'll continue to reserve our time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just because my colleague from Indiana just came. The Indiana Department of Environmental Management wrote a letter in support of this bill and because of its safety and protection. Now I'd like to recognize from the state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly rise in support of this legislation, H.R. 2218. I heard some comments today about coal ash. We should be very clear. Coal ash maybe at one point was energetic, but the coal ash we're discussing here today is inert. It's a lot like dirt, to be quite honest. And as a co-chair of the Congressional Cement Caucus, I have the largest cement-producing district in America. I strongly rise in support of this legislation. Cement and concrete folks, the industry, is by far the nation's largest recycler of coal combustion residuals, or CCRs, or coal ash as it's better known. Each year, more than 11 million tons of coal ash is recycled into the production of concrete. So this is essential to our manufacturing sector. Domestic manufacturers typically reuse an additional 3 million tons of coal ash annually as a raw material in cement production. The coal ash used in the process serves as a substitute for key ingredients in cement, which would otherwise be mined. Without H.R. 2218, the EPA would be able to classify coal ash as a hazardous material, which in turn would put an end to this very useful recycling. Even the continued regulatory uncertainty generated by the stalled EPA rulemaking would dramatically inhibit the recycling of coal ash in domestic cement and concrete production. This recycling includes all kinds of infrastructure products, including our roads, bridges, homes, schools, and other critical structures. Coal ash continues to be recycled in a safe, responsible manner. Whatever issues there have been with coal ash, they have largely been related to storage. This bill thoroughly addresses coal ash storage issues, which is really where we should be focused. Again, H.R. 2218 provides clarity needed by top recyclers to continue their efforts and to potentially increase coal ash recycling. So again, I ask my colleagues to support passage of this important piece of legislation that will ensure the beneficial reuse of coal ash. A yes vote is the right vote. It is pro-manufacturing. Vote for the legislation. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, when coal ash is recycled, it is not a waste, and therefore EPA has no jurisdiction. It is not a problem. When coal ash is put into a landfill or disposal site and leaches into the water, then it is a problem. And this bill doesn't address that problem. It doesn't adequately assure protection of the public health, or if they have a law at the state level that seems to talk about public health, there's no clear enforcement of it. So that is our problem with the legislation. Recycling coal ash for any purpose doesn't make it hazardous, it doesn't make it toxic, it can be reused, and we want to encourage that. But we don't want public health threatened. That's what our concern is all about. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleague from California, we're waiting for a few members. I'm not sure they're going to get here. I'm willing to have you close, and then I'll close after you're done. So if you want to, I yield back.
Wait, gentleman
reserves.
reserves.
My time.
Okay. Gentleman from California.
Knowing that we want to wrap up this general debate, I just will repeat that EPA proposed to act, and that is what has caused this whole furor, rather than discuss what is the appropriate balance between EPA and the states. The Republican bill would take this away from EPA, keep them from regulating, and turn it over to the states, where the states can already act, and many have. They don't need us to give them the power to act. This bill says it's up to the states. It doesn't have a uniform standard of protecting public health. It doesn't require states to have the goal of protecting the public health. And if the states achieve the goal as they in their legislation to protect public health, there's no guarantee of it being enforced, because EPA cannot come back in and enforce the state law even. And citizens cannot file lawsuits. That's one of the so-called improvements that has been made since the last time this bill was before us. It has weakened the ability to enforce protection of public health. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and in doing so, tell us to go back and work on the problem and get a real, true bipartisan bill that can be supported by the majority of the Democrats and by the President of the United States. I urge members to vote against the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of the time. It's been a great debate. It's been a great process. I'll just summarize some of the issues. Yes, the issue is about beneficial reuse, like this shingle here, but it's also about the storage. We were very close to passing this piece of legislation in the last Congress, as the ranking member knows. This bill is better, as my colleague from Texas says. There's 12 additional changes made in this bill versus last year's bill, that addresses many of the concerns that the minority asked, and also concerns by the Environmental Protection Agency. We've worked very, very, very closely with them. That is why, and I'll say it again, the administration has not issued a veto threat on this bill. That's a signal that they may have issues, but there's not an outright veto threat on this bill. That's a signal that we've worked with them to address some of the major concerns. Again, I want to highlight some of the special interest groups that are forcing this legislation, like the United Mine Workers, the building and construction trades, the transportation workers, those who are historically considered in the minorities coalition, are now moving to the pro-job coalition of this bill and hopefully other bills in the future. Also, I want to just reemphasize that the EPA in 1993 and 2000, that coal ash does not have the characteristics of hazardous waste, including toxicity, and should not be regulated under Subtitle C. That's not us, that's the EPA, and that's the EPA making that ruling twice. We believe that the federal government can set standards. We believe that the federal government can enforce that the states do certification, and we trust the states to be able to monitor and meet the standards. That's why we have the Environmental Council of the states. I listed Indiana's Department of the Environment in support, because what they want to do is get a handle on this. And let's not confuse the issue. If the EPA is able to label fly ash as toxic, it does depress the beneficial use. So the cheap concrete that's mixed with fly ash will not be put in. The road mitigation issues which we've done will not be put in. My colleague MARSHA BLACKBURN did a great job talking about how we use today coal ash and fly ash. So I want to thank my colleague Mr. McKinley for moving this bill, and my colleagues on the subcommittee who have made the changes and moved it forward. We look forward to the debates on the amendment, and we look forward to passing of the bill and sending it to the other chamber, and eventually a signature by the President of the United States. And with that, for this part, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce printed in the bill shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part A of House Report 113-174. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report and shall be considered as read, should be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by a proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division on the question. It's now in order to consider Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 113-174. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer a common sense amendment to ensure that every state that chooses to allow coal ash impoundments as outlined in this bill has a strong emergency response plan in the unfortunate event of a leak or spill. Sadly, the 2008 failure of a coal ash impoundment in Kingston, Tennessee, highlights the very devastation a spill can have on a community. As was widely reported at the time, a breach in a surface impoundment pond at the Tennessee Valley Authority's Kingston facility released more than 5 million cubic yards of coal ash, covering more than 300 acres in toxic sludge, damaging and destroying homes and property. As we speak, there is still a federal Superfund cleanup site where the total cost could top more than $1.2 billion. Absent a plan, what could go wrong? Beyond that staggering price tag, let us not forget that the lasting economic and health impacts on the surrounding communities resulting from this spill are catastrophic. Families were displaced from their homes. Some residents still suffer from respiratory illnesses and other side effects. Arsenic levels where the Kingston coal ash runoff was disposed of are measured at 80 times higher than the amount legally allowed under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the EPA already has said such exposure significantly increases a lifetime risk of cancer. These are just the impacts we know of today. Who knows what the unknown health consequences might be? The Kingston incident is not an isolated event, sadly. According to Earthjustice, there have been more than 211 known cases of coal ash contamination and spills in 37 different states. And according to the EPA, 45 impoundments are currently considered high hazard, meaning that a failure will probably cause loss of human life. Of course, this bill doesn't concern itself with those problems or apply the lessons learned. In response to the Kingston incident, former Tennessee Governor Phil Bredesen even acknowledged that the state's environmental regulations, mostly written in the 1970s, simply don't take into account a disaster such as the ash spill in Kingston. And he said, we need a top-to-bottom review of those policies. As we've already seen, the federal government is forced to step in when disasters such as this take place. Yet, rather than make the federal government a partner or even a resource, this bill turns sole responsibility over to the states. There ought to be a clear minimum set of standards for EPA to identify and remedy state program deficiencies, stronger groundwater protection standards, and clear and appropriate authority for taking potential corrective action on unlined or leaking impoundments. That seems common sense. The original amendment would have ensured that states certify their coal ash site permitting plans annually, including up-to-date emergency response plans. The House majority thought regular reporting was nothing more than a paperwork exercise, so I now offer this revised amendment in keeping with their concerns to ensure at a minimum that states have thorough and comprehensive emergency response plans to address a spill or a leak. We cannot simply count on private enterprise to be prepared for spill. The state and local governments, who are the first responders, must be active partners. By requiring them to provide EPA simply with their own emergency response plans, we're taking a modest step to ensure they're prepared to respond to an emergency, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Who claims time in opposition?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
But I don't oppose the amendment. I want to thank my colleague for working with us and making some changes that we thought was appropriate. We agree with the colleague from Virginia that states should identify what their emergency response procedures are and in the certification process, so we are prepared to accept it. We thank him for his work. He's made it a better bill. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I thank my colleague, and I look forward to working with him. And with that, I yield back, unless the distinguished ranking member wishes time. Does the distinguished ranking member wish time? Otherwise, I'm going to yield back.
Please, thank you for being so generous to want to yield me time, but I certainly support your amendment and urge all of our colleagues to support it as well.
I thank the gentleman. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time has been yielded back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. It's now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in Part A of the House Report 113-7A. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Pursuant to the Resolution 315, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under all of our environmental laws, the federal government sets a standard, and then the states implement the law looking at the different circumstances in their community. For example, the Clean Air Act says, in effect, everywhere in this country, we cannot have air pollution that exceeds the standard to protect the public health. But the states decide the implementation to achieve that standard. Under this bill, we're not setting a national standard. We're telling the states to set a standard. If we're going to let the states set the standard, my amendment would require that the standard in every state be to protect the public health, to protect human health and the environment. That's the goal of these laws, and that should be the requirement under this law. The standards are the yardsticks under which we determine whether a state's effort measures up and ensures a consistent level of protection throughout the nation. If we're not going to have a national standard by EPA, let's require the state to set that standard. This is an approach that has worked well because it ensures that all Americans enjoy a minimum level of protection, and residents of one state are not threatened by inadequate laws in a neighboring state. For example, if one state has a good, strong law to protect the public health, another state trying to get the business away from the one state to locate in theirs will drop their standards lower to try to entice that business to relocate. The laxest protection becomes the dumping ground for the neighboring states. We don't want to put states in a race to the bottom. When Congress passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, we assigned EPA a simple mission: to protect human health and the environment from unsafe disposal of solid waste. Achieving that mission can be complex, but we have a clear goal. It provides direction for the agency's technical work. But the bill we are considering today doesn't contain this standard. Disposal of household garbage, for example, must be disposed in a way that protects human health. But under this bill, coal ash would not be required to be disposed of in a way that protects human health. So my amendment would fix this serious problem by calling on the states to require measures necessary to protect human health and the environment. If we had the Republicans willing to accept the amendment that every state have an emergency plan, we're simply asking that every state have a goal clearly stated to achieve the protection of human health and the environment. Otherwise, a state's plan is not adequate. There would be no recourse as long as the state meets all the other requirements of this law, but still does not get to the goal. And the Congressional Research Service examined this legislation, and they told us that nothing in H.R. 2218 requires the states to establish programs that will achieve any specified level of federal standard of protection. So CRS concluded, quote, the degree to which a state program made to protect human health from risks specific to coal ash disposal would not be known until individual states begin to interpret the bill. That means one thing we know for sure is that this bill will take EPA off the beat. Take EPA off the beat, like we took the SEC off the beat and other regulators where Wall Street took huge risks and drove our economy over the cliff. We'll take the EPA off the beat, and then we'll gamble on each state government doing a good job. That's a pretty risky gamble. And if it doesn't pay off, who's going to suffer? Well, the price will be borne by communities in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Alabama, elsewhere, whose water supplies will suffer from toxic contamination. This is members from some of those states come in here and argue we need those jobs. Well, of course we need the jobs, and we're going to keep those jobs. But why shouldn't, in keeping jobs, the waste disposals be constructed in a way that will not pollute our drinking water and harm human health? If a community's water supply becomes too toxic,
Gentleman's time has expired.
So I would urge that we set this standard in the bill and adopt this amendment.
Who claims time in opposition? For what purpose the gentleman from West Virginia rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
First, I want to just add a congratulations to my colleague from California whose position apparently has evolved over the last couple of years. Because I remember back in 2011, he had a problem and voted against the recycling material. So to hear him today say how he favors that,
accurate statement.
I appreciate that. That was on H.R. 1 in February of 2011. But as for this amendment, this is not necessary because 2218 establishes a minimum standard for protection of coal ash permit programs. The standard of protection is the minimum requirement that's set out for this bill and includes protections such as groundwater monitoring, corrective action, financial assurance, specific cleanup and closure requirements for unlined leaking impoundments, stringent structural stability requirements, and fugitive dust controls. Furthermore, 2218 establishes a minimum national standard that is based on the existing criteria for municipal solid waste landfills, which were promulgated by EPA to, quote, protect human health and the environment. This chart is just a collection of some of the elements that are included in the bill already to deal with standards. Things like requiring that the structure be located above water tables. The groundwater monitoring is to be included in this. We have surface water controls under Section 4011. Controls for CCR landfills, control runoff for CCR surface, accelerated correction action for unlined surface impoundments. We included in this bill and included in here, if people would read the bill, they would see that under 4011, there are areas where the EPA can help to identify deficiencies, including specific criteria for undertaking a deficiency review. It has a backstop authority to enforce that these requirements are upheld and to correct any EPA identified deficiency. My colleague continues to use this race to the bottom among states, and they were competing with each other to become the dumping ground for neighboring states. That's a misguided assumption and frankly an insult to the hardworking state environmental regulators. It is unfortunate that he also does not trust the environmental regulators in his state, or any other state for that matter, to establish permit programs that are protective. My colleague ignores that the state regulators are tasked every day with protecting human health and the environment. Another problem with his amendment is not well defined. The EPA or a judge would have sole discretion to determine what constitutes, quote, protecting human health and the environment. Any state failing to meet this subjective and ambiguous statement or standard would have their permit program stripped from them to be run by the EPA. This amendment diminishes the important role of the states and lets the EPA meddle in a program the states have proven that they're capable of handling. This amendment is not about protecting human health and the environment. It's about growing federal control at the expense of the states. States have been tasked with implementing RCRA, and this bill allows them to continue to do just that. If you support bigger government, support this amendment. But if you trust your state to take care of its own people, then we should oppose it. I urge the opposition to this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves, but the gentleman is the only one left with time. Gentleman from West Virginia.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. All time has expired on the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The noes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman asks for a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 113-174. For what purpose the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, I believe amendment number 3.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are a nation of 50 states, but we are bound together by common history, purpose, and laws. Prior to the passage of national environmental laws, states had individual regulatory programs that offered a patchwork of protection. We tried this system for air, for water, for toxic waste, and for a number of many other things. That is the system we have today for the disposal of coal combustion residuals that cannot be recycled. It did not work. It does not work. H.R. 2218 will not correct the problems with coal ash disposal. We have a state-by-state program for coal ash disposal now. H.R. 2218 codifies that situation and goes further to prevent the EPA from exercising its authority to require that state programs provide a basic standard to ensure that all citizens are indeed protected. My amendment authorizes a proper federal role, a role of oversight for the EPA to ensure the actions of one state do not result in negative impacts on a state with which it shares an important resource. In addition, my amendment would enable a state to request that EPA review the permitting program of another state to ensure that the program offered sufficient protection of its citizens and its resources. We do not allow northern states along the Mississippi River to dump toxic substances into the river for downstream states to clean up. We do not allow individual states to pollute the air and send the pollution well beyond their borders. We need a better system for dealing with coal combustion wastes, a system that applies fairly across our great country. You might wonder how often the location of a coal ash facility is near enough to a shared resource or a state's border to cause a potential problem. Well, it turns out it is common. The failure of a coal ash facility associated with the Martins Creek power plant in Pennsylvania affected communities in New Jersey when coal ash spilled into the Delaware River. Residents of the state of Michigan were upset when the failure of an old coal ash impoundment in Wisconsin sent coal ash, mud, and machinery into Lake Michigan. And several of the coal combustion disposal facilities on the high hazard list in Ohio and West Virginia are located along the Ohio River, a shared border and resource of these two states. Well, I could go on. It turns out that Because these facilities are often located in close proximity to coal-fired utilities where the waste is generated, they are also close to water required for cooling and steam generation. A number are located near sizable water sources that serve multiple communities and often multiple states. And so, in order to ensure good relations between neighboring states and to ensure that all our citizens are protected from exposure to the toxic substances contained in coal ash, I believe the EPA should have the authority to step in when necessary. The system we have used successfully, based upon common standards that ensure the protection of human health and the environment, should be applied to this situation. We cannot afford another episode like the one in Kingston, Tennessee. The choice is not about whether we can have a clean, healthy environment or a robust economy. We can have both. Part of the formula for ensuring a robust economy includes having a clean environment. Pollution is not cost-free. It costs us lost work days, illness, and premature deaths. It devalues property and results in expensive, unnecessary cleanup costs. We can do better. My amendment will improve this bill and protect all our citizens and their shared resources. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois, for what purpose does he rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state permit program must incorporate the minimum requirements which are based on regulations promulgated by the EPA to quote-unquote protect human health and the environment, which include groundwater monitoring of all structures, fugitive dust control, structure stability requirements, and closure of structures that cannot be corrected. The premise of this is if you have federal standards that they're not protective and that the states will not do that. We find this debate very curious in that my colleagues on the other side have so much of a disrespect for the states and their environmental communities and the ability of states to ensure the protection of human health, the environment, from a state position. Federal standards, state certification process, states under RCRA, the states do this anyway. This is what the states do. Under the Municipal Solid Waste Disposal Act, the states are the ones who are enforcing this. All we're doing is saying we can do this now for fly ash and coal ash. So while my colleague's amendment is well-intentioned, it really undercuts the purpose of the legislation and is unnecessary because the bill contains specific criteria by which the EPA will judge state permit programs, and I listed those earlier. This is political appealing amendment, but it has many flaws, not the least of which is that any state can request that EPA review another state's coal combustion residual permit program regardless of the location and whether there is actually a cross-border impact. As my colleague pointed out in the Rules Committee on Tuesday, there's no requirement in this amendment that a state that requests a review needs to even be impacted by the contamination allegedly coming from another state. While my colleague has probably scoured the country to come up with an example or two of coal ash contamination crossing state lines, the fact of the matter is that cross-boundary contamination not really is an issue with respect to coal ash disposal, because regulation of solid waste disposal is typically an issue that remains within the state. This amendment attempts to create another hook for the EPA to measure state coal combustion residuals permit programs using the subjective yardstick of what is protective of human health and the environment, which my colleague did a good job defending in the other amendment. I understand that my colleague believes that the federal government must step in to save the day, but I trust that our state environmental regulators are up to the task of making sure that our communities are protected. This amendment diminishes the important role of the states, and I urge opposition to this amendment. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chair, I respect the work done by my colleague from Illinois, but respectfully disagree with his assessment. There's ample evidence that states have poorly regulated, in some cases, this waste stream, and it puts at risk innocent bystanders who are impacted by their actions. And so I stand by the worthiness of this amendment. Again, encourage my colleagues to support it. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and reserve and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back. All time for the amendment has been yielded. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on the amendments printed in Part A of House Report 113-174, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Waxman of California, Amendment number 3 by Mr. Tonko of New York. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in the series. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 113-174 by the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, on which the further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the ayes are 185, the nays are 231. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business, the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 3, Part A of the House Report 113-174 by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, in which the further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request of a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members record their vote by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. 2-minute vote. Members have 1 minute to record their vote. 1 minute. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change the vote? On this vote, the yeas are 176, the nays are 235. The amendment is 239. The amendment is not adopted. Question is on the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute's amendment. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rule, the committee rises. Speaker, the Committee on the Whole House on the State of the Union has had under consideration H.R. 2218. Pursuant to House Resolution 315, I report the bill back to the House for the amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 2218, and pursuant to House Resolution 315, reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Is a separate vote demanded on the amendment to the amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the question is on adoption of the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act to encourage recovery and beneficial use of coal combustion residuals and establish requirements for the proper management and disposal of coal combustion residuals that are protective of human health and the environment.
The House will come to order. The chair would ask all members to please take their conversations from the floor. The chair would ask all members to please take their seats. All members and staff to please take their conversations from the floor. Chair would ask all members who have flights to please take their seats. Please take their conversations from the floor. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentlelady opposed to the bill?
In its current form, I am, sir.
The gentlelady qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. McCollum of Minnesota moves to recommit the bill H.R. 2218 to the Committee on Energy and Commerce with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Page 7, after line 14, insert the following new clause. 1. Protecting drinking water and the Great Lakes. The implementing agency shall require that all wet disposal structures meet criteria for design, construction, operation, and maintenance sufficient to prevent contamination of groundwater and sources of drinking water, including the Great Lakes.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Order against the motion to recommit.
Point of order is reserved. Again, the chair would respectfully ask all members to please take their conversations from the floor. Please take their seats, as the gentlelady from Minnesota deserves to be heard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady will suspend for just one more minute. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the final amendment to the bill, which does not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, it will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. This bill is about coal ash. Coal ash is a toxic substance. It contains lead, selenium, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. Coal ash is a deadly poison, and it must be kept out of America's drinking water. This bill needlessly puts millions of Americans at risk by doing nothing to prevent coal ash from contaminating groundwater, surface water, and the greatest supply of fresh water on the earth, the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes provide drinking water to more than 30 million people. Over 1.5 million jobs are connected.
The gentleman is correct. The gentlelady from Minnesota will suspend until the House comes to order. The House would again ask all members to please take their conversations from the floor. Irrespective of the members' conversation, would ask those members to take their seats so that the gentlelady can be heard. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you again. Over 1.5 million jobs are connected to the Great Lakes and more than $60 billion in annual wages. My amendment protects the Great Lakes from improper and dangerous storage of coal ash. This amendment requires all wet disposal structures to meet criteria for design, construction, operation, and maintenance sufficient to prevent contamination of surface and groundwater. This amendment recognizes that the Great Lakes are unique. Mayors and governors in 8 states are working together to maintain this vital ecosystem and economy for families, businesses, and future generations, even while this House considers an 80% cut to the Great Lakes Restorative Initiative. In addition, the federal government coordinates with our efforts to protect, conserve, and restore the Great Lakes with our partner, Canada. The great United States has both a national and international interest in keeping these lakes clean and safe. Protecting the Great Lakes should be a priority for this Congress. I am certain it's a priority for the 30 million people who drink Great Lakes water. Without this amendment, they will be at risk of drinking cancer-causing toxins. Right now, coal ash is placed in unlined ponds, some that are leaking, leaching, and spilling into our soils, lakes, rivers, and aquifers. In 2011, near Milwaukee, a bluff collapsed, sending a utility company's coal ash directly into Lake Michigan. Residents could no longer drink their local water because of severe health threats imposed by the coal ash. Should a utility company be able to store tons and tons of coal ash in an unregulated ravine? The answer is simply no. Unless Congress changes how coal ash is stored, the Great Lakes and America's drinking water will continue to be at risk. Congress can do something right here, right now, by passing this amendment. If you want clean and safe drinking water, vote for this amendment. If you want to protect the Great Lakes, vote for this amendment. And if you want to protect recreation, manufacturing, and service jobs, vote for this amendment. If you have the courage to stand up to the polluters and say, no longer will I allow coal ash to be inadvertently put in our drinking water, causing cancer for millions of Americans, vote for this amendment. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from Illinois rise.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my point of order and claim time in opposition.
The point of order is withdrawn. The House will be in order before the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the basic premise of this bill is that the federal government can set safety standards and the states can enforce it. So I'm going to reject the motion to instruct. I'm going to turn my comments to people who live in the coal areas of our country. Coal is just not a commodity product. It's really a way of lifestyle if you live in coal country. I'm a 4th generation Lithuanian immigration family. My great-grandfather went directly into the coal fields. My grandfather went into the coal mines at age 10. He performed the job of a trapper. In my hometown of Collinsville, Illinois, we have Miners Theater. In the community up north, we have Miners Park. And in Gillespie, Illinois, we have Black Diamond Days. Coal is a culture. Coal is who we are. And that's why I really appreciate my colleagues from West Virginia, David McKinley and Shelley Moore Capital. There are some states in this union that coal is their only job. And that's why they fight and they stand up for coal. I remember being with the late Senator Byrd on a rally in the mall, on a rally to save coal jobs. He held up his hands. He says, there's coal in these veins. This is Senator Byrd. There's coal in these veins. My colleagues and my friends, that's how we feel in coal-producing states in this country. It is part of who we are. It is our culture. Now, don't think this is a passé debate. There's a young Iraqi vet named Jimmy Rose. You may have seen him. He's 32 years old. He's also a coal miner. He's competing on America's Got Talent. And you know what his song is? His song is, Coal Keeps the Lights On. He talks about feeding his family. He talks about putting clothes on in the family household. He talks about that's their livelihood, that's their culture. It's an impassioned ballad for areas of our country that feel
under attack, left behind, attacked by this administration. Mayor Deeds from McLeansboro, Illinois is having a new coal's opening up. Coal is keeping the lights on in the small communities and the shops and stores for a community that's kind of been left behind for 40 years. He's excited about the jobs and the tax base that's coming because of coal. I'm asking you, my colleagues, to stand up for coal, because coal keeps the lights on. I request that you reject this amendment and support the underlining bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to recommit. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote, please.
The gentlelady from Minnesota requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise, a sufficient number having arisen. A recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on the question on passage of the bill, if ordered, and the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, if ordered. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 192, the nays are 25 with one voting present. 225. The nays are 225 with one voting present. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from California.
On that vote, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the ayes are 265, the nays are 155. The ayes have it. The bill is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 2218.
Without objection.